Why did no one rise when she entered the courtroom? That question would haunt her for days, maybe longer. She sat already marked, wrists bound, chains biting skin, the clatter of metal loud enough to echo in her chest. Cameras snapped, flashes slicing the stale air of the military tribunal chamber. Every click, every whisper turned her life into spectacle. Blackwood Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL, America's first female sniper in the teams, and now branded a liar. Her name carried weight once, now it carried mockery. She kept her face still, posture straight. The years of discipline refused to abandon her even as the courtroom murmured like vultures circling. Someone coughed, someone else muttered, and beneath it all came the quiet sound of papers being shuffled by men who already believed her guilty. The handcuffs came off. Her skin carried their imprint, faint bruises at the wrist. She did not rub them. To acknowledge pain was to admit defeat, and she would not give them that. Her uniform was spotless, pressed, polished, yet strangely bare. Minimal ribbons pinned over her chest. It wasn't that she hadn't earned more. It was that so many of the operations that had defined her career, operations that had cost her friends' lives, were locked away, sealed behind the word classified. That silence had always been her shield. Today it was her prison. The judge's gavel cracked through the whispers. All rise. Feet scraped, benches groaned, but respect felt absent. The honorable captain, silver hair, lines carved by decades of procedure, surveyed the room. He looked not at her but at the crowd, at the circus this had become. The words rang, "This court is now in session." And so it began. The prosecution wasted no time. Commander, sharp uniform, sharper smile, spoke with the confidence of a man who had already written the verdict in his head. He painted her as fraud, manipulator, danger to the men she once stood beside. A fame seeker, a liar in uniform. Stolen valor, he declared. The gallery muttered approval, disgust, disbelief. Words hissed through the air like arrows. She couldn't hack it. Political correctness gone too far. She made it up. Did not turn, did not react. She learned long ago that silence could be armor, but armor was heavy. And sitting there, shoulders squared, chin lifted, she felt its crushing weight. Her lawyer, Lieutenant Commander Orion Apprentice, leaned close, voice low enough for only her to hear. "They're going for blood. Give me something, anything." She kept her eyes forward. "You know I cannot." "Cannot or will not." His frustration cut like broken glass. "They'll put you away if you don't fight." She let the corner of her mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, not quite surrender. "I made my choice a long time ago." He swore under his breath. The trial unfurled with mechanical cruelty. Witnesses paraded through, each more damning than the last. Administrative officers with clean records and clipped voices swore she'd never served in Yemen. No records, no operations, nothing. She had, according to the black and white evidence, never been where she claimed to be. Her reputation was being dismantled, piece by piece, like a rifle stripped down on a workbench. Every bolt, every spring laid out for inspection, and every missing part interpreted as failure. Through it all she sat motionless, but inside. Inside she remembered. Sandstorms swallowing voices, the metallic tang of blood in the air, radio calls lost in gunfire, a helicopter rotor thumping against the chaos of extraction. The prosecution could erase her paperwork, but they could not erase the smell of cordite from her lungs. They could not erase the faces she'd carried with her since Yemen. But she could not say that. Not here. Not when the word classified stood taller than truth. Commander Harrison Drake took the stand next, her former commanding officer, the man who had once signed her evaluations with neat strokes of ink. His hair was salt and pepper now, but his voice was steady, practiced. "She was an intelligence analyst," he said. "Not a sniper, not an operator. She overstepped, she disobeyed, she endangered lives." She felt her fists clench under the table until her knuckles turned bone white. Drake did not even look at her as he spoke. He had already rewritten the past, and the courtroom listened like his words were scripture. Apprentice rose to cross-examine, but every question met the same shield: classified. The mission's details, classified. The location, classified. The men involved, classified. Convenient thought, how silence could be bent to serve either side. The judge reminded counsel to proceed. Apprentice sat down hard, his jaw tight, and for the first time, eyes unfocused. Memory her, blood on her hands, shouts swallowed by desert wind. A man dying under her fingertips, whispering his daughter's name. She blinked, forced herself back. The courtroom would not see her break. But they saw her silence as weakness. A naval doctor followed, testifying with cold detachment. His report claimed she suffered from delusions of grandeur, that she had fabricated heroism to mask insecurities in a male-dominated world. She created fantasies of achievement, he said, adjusting his glasses, to cope with exclusion. The gallery snickered, one voice too loud. They let her play seal, people died. Her lawyer pressed for recess. In the small room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, he cornered her. I can't defend you if you won't talk. Those records, classified or not, could save you. She met his gaze for the first time in days. Her eyes, dark and steady, carried fire. They don't exist anymore. He blinked. That's impossible. Someone had to. You're not asking the right questions. Her voice was low, controlled. Ask who benefits from my silence. You're staring down dishonorable discharge, prison. She straightened. Some oaths matter more than freedom. It silenced him. For once he saw what others refused to. This wasn't stubborn pride. It was sacrifice. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution revealed its blade. A new witness, Chief Petty Officer Talon. Broad-shouldered, self-assured, the kind of man who looked the part of a warrior. He swore he had led the Yemen operation. He swore she had never been there. His voice was firm, his details precise. And for the first time her mask cracked. That man was never in Yemen, she whispered. But the room leaned toward him, not her. His testimony dismantled her story line by line, leaving only ashes in the jury's hands. Still, as she studied him, something flickered. His uniform, his trident pin, the arrangement of ribbons, details so small most eyes would skim past, but she noticed, and a ghost of a smile touched her lips. She scribbled a note, slid it to Apprentice. He read, frowned, and began to question. Dates, commanders, operation names at first flowed smoothly, then hesitation, a slip, a contradiction. And the seed of doubt was planted. For the first time, officers in the gallery exchanged glances. For the first time, the tide shifted. But doubt was not acquittal, not yet. As court adjourned, Apprentice leaned close. What did you see? His tridents mounted wrong. His ribbons contradict each other. That's enough to expose him. Not here, not now. Her voice was quiet but steady. But someone will notice. Tomorrow will be interesting. And for the first time in weeks, as the MPs took her back into custody, she allowed herself to feel it. Not hope, not yet. But the faintest edge of possibility. What happens when truth itself is locked behind the word classified? By the third day of the court-martial, that question hung like smoke in the air. The gallery was fuller than before. Journalists from national outlets had flown in, cameras flashed in bursts, and the whispers grew louder. What had started as a military trial now looked like spectacle. And through it all sat, thinner than before, her uniform hanging just slightly looser at the collar, the dark hollows under her eyes betraying nights without sleep. The prosecution pressed forward with confidence. Commander carried himself like a man convinced he was putting on the final strokes of a performance. He circled the witness stand with measured steps, his words rehearsed to inflict damage. Every question chipped away at what remained of his reputation. Her attorney, Orion Apprentice, scribbled notes, his frustration clear in every furrow of his brow. Every time he rose to challenge, the same brick wall met him, Objection sustained, material is classified. It was a slow strangulation, one he could not fight without cooperation, and she gave him nothing. But her silence wasn't weakness, it was something else, something heavier. Because in her silence lived memory. She remembered the Yemen desert. She remembered men she had fought beside, men who would never sit in a courtroom again, their names sealed in reports the world would never see. She remembered radio calls drowned in gunfire, the frantic breath of a hostage clinging to her arm as she pulled him from a cell. All of it was locked away, and her silence was the last barrier protecting those who had not made it out alive. Still, she knew what the gallery thought when they saw her bowed head. They thought she had nothing to say. They thought silence was confession. The naval doctor's testimony had been damning enough. But when Talon returned to the stand, the mood shifted darker still. Had the presence of a man accustomed to command, square jaw, confident tone. He looked the part of a SEAL operator, his words painted as reckless, delusional, a danger in the field. She was never on the ground, he said, his voice smooth, his eyes steady. Not in Yemen, not in Syria, not anywhere she claimed. The gallery leaned in, devouring every word. Apprentice tried to peel back's testimony, pressing on inconsistencies, and though a few cracks appeared, held fast, his voice unwavering. But knew better. She had seen it in the tilt of his ribbons, in the misaligned trident pin. She knew the kind of details men like never understood unless they had lived the life for real. She leaned forward, whispering to Apprentice, "Watch him carefully. He slips when the questions go sideways." Apprentice tried, but the judge grew impatient. "Mr. Apprentice, keep your questions relevant." Every attempt to expose fraud was slapped down, and still sat, expression unreadable, though her pulse hammered in her throat. When recess came, Apprentice cornered her again. His tie was loosened, his face flushed with exhaustion. "You're sitting here, letting them bury you alive. You saw him crack. Why won't you let me go for the throat?" She fixed him with a level gaze. "Because the throat isn't here." "What does that even mean?" She did not answer, not directly. "Truth isn't decided in this room." "You think silence is going to save you?" "No," she said quietly, "but it may save others." And with that, the wall of silence between them grew higher. Apprentice turned away, muttering something under his breath, but part of him, small, reluctant, understood. Back in session, his voice grew sharp, hungry. He wanted the finishing blow. He wanted the courtroom to believe that by the end of today, Blackwood would be nothing more than a disgrace in uniform. He led step by step, dismantling her career, her service, her honor. And for most in the gallery, it worked. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding her gaze, others looking at her with pity or worse, contempt. But then it happened. The doors opened. Not with hesitation, not with apology, but with deliberate weight. The sound cut through's cadence, through's polished lies, through the scrape of pens and the hiss of whispers. 2 naval security officers entered first. Their eyes scanned the room like spotlights, their presence out of place in a trial that had already been secured. And then her. Admiral Kingston, Chief of Naval Operations. 4 stars on her shoulders, history in her stride, the first woman ever to hold the position. Her presence was thunder contained in a uniform. The gallery froze. The judge himself stood, the mask of judicial neutrality slipping for just a heartbeat. "Admiral, this is highly irregular," he began. She didn't respond. She didn't look at him. She walked forward, every step deliberate, the heels of her shoes striking the polished floor like drumbeats of inevitability. And after weeks of silence, weeks of humiliation, rose to attention. The action wasn't choice. It was muscle memory, the instinct of a sailor who had spent her life in the shadow of chain of command. Her chin lifted, her eyes locked forward, and when Kingston stopped directly before her, the silence in the room was absolute. The salute came like lightning. Admiral Kingston's hand, precise, formal, sharp as a blade. His own hand rose in reply before thought could catch it. Their salutes met in the space between them, and in that moment, every whisper in the gallery died. For the first time, allowed herself to breathe. "Lieutenant Commander Blackwood," Kingston said, her voice carrying without effort, "the President sends his regards, and regrets that operation cannot be at this time." The room erupted. Journalists scrambled, pens flying across notepads, phones buzzing. Officers shifted uneasily, their faces a mix of confusion and dawning realization. The judge stammered, "Admiral, this court." But Kingston's eyes cut to him, steel and authority in a single glance. She handed a sealed folder to the bailiff. "By executive order of the President, these proceedings are suspended. Lieutenant Commander Blackwood is reassigned, effective immediately." Leapt to his feet, his voice cracked on anger. "Admiral, with respect, this court has jurisdiction." "Commander," Kingston said, her tone like frost, "your clearance is revoked pending investigation. You will surrender yourself to military police immediately." The color drained from his face. Two MPs stepped forward, their presence undeniable. For the first time since this began, faltered. The gallery sat in stunned silence. His hand twitched toward his trident pin, then froze, too late to hide the mistake. Stood at attention, her face unreadable, but inside something shifted. The weight she had carried, the silence, the shame, lifted, if only by an inch. She had not been wrong to keep her oath. She had not been wrong to remain silent. And for the first time, she felt the stirrings of something that had nearly died in her: vindication. What happens when a single salute changes everything? The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was chaos contained in four walls. Reporters shouted questions across the gallery. Pencils scratched furiously. Cell phones buzzed as frantic hands typed headlines before the ink was even dry. Officers who had sat rigid and expressionless just moments before now whispered to one another, their polished bearing cracking under the weight of uncertainty. Captain banged his gavel. "Order, order in this court." But his voice was swallowed whole. Nothing could restore order to what had just happened. Remained at attention, her salute finished, her shoulders squared. She hadn't moved a muscle since Kingston's words had struck the room like thunder. The highest-ranking woman in the Navy had just confirmed what had carried in silence for months, that her mission had been real, that the blood on her hands had not been fantasy, that her silver star was not stolen. But it wasn't vindication she felt in that moment, not yet. It was something sharper, something that cut deeper than applause ever could. Relief, yes, but tangled in it was anger. Anger at how close she had come to ruin. Anger at how silence, once her weapon, had nearly been her undoing. Admiral Kingston's voice carried above the din, steady, precise. This tribunal was convened on evidence, part of a deliberate campaign to discredit an American operator. Those responsible will face investigation and court-martial. The words dropped heavy in the air. "Drake." Their faces paled, their eyes flicking toward the exits as if escape were possible. But escape in the Navy was never possible. Not when an admiral had spoken, not when NCIS officers were already stepping forward, their suits sharp, their eyes sharper. Kingston turned back too. "You are needed at the Pentagon, Commander. A helicopter is waiting." Not a request, not an offer, an order. Straightened, her voice firm. "Yes, Admiral." And with that the trial was over, not by verdict, but by truth too large to be contained in open record. As Kingston moved to leave, followed. Cameras swung, flashes stuttered across her face. She didn't flinch, not anymore. The silence she had carried now stood transformed into something else, proof. The gallery erupted as they stepped into the aisle. Questions fired from all directions. "Commander Blackwood, did you really lead a SEAL team?" "Admiral Kingston, what is operation? Is this political interference in military justice?" Neither woman answered. They walked with purpose, flanked by security. Every step forward felt like pushing through noise and disbelief, but's posture did not waver. At the doors, she allowed herself a glance backward. Drake sat rigid, his face pale, his eyes locked on the NCIS officers closing in. Shifted, his once confident shoulders hunched, the misplaced trident pin on his chest now a brand of shame. For the first time, saw fear in their faces. And it was enough. Outside, the world was waiting. The base courtyard was lined with media vans, cameras mounted on shoulders, lenses long and hungry. Reporters shouted questions into the open air, voices rising above one another in desperation. Security personnel forced a corridor open, holding the crowd back as Kingston and walked through. The questions came again, louder, sharper. Commander Blackwood, are you a fraud or a hero? Did the Navy cover up missions overseas? Admiral Kingston, are you confirming the existence of? Kept her gaze locked forward. Silence had saved her. Silence would continue to protect what was still hidden. But inside the armor of that silence, her thoughts churned. She had lived months in confinement, alone, cut off, labeled a liar, a fraud, a disgrace. She had survived humiliation in uniform, the sting of whispers, the ache of chains on her wrists, and now suddenly it was gone. No, not gone, shifted. The wound was still there. The scar had already formed. As they approached the waiting vehicle, Kingston's expression softened just slightly. The Admiral's voice, low but firm, reached only ears. That was quite a performance. Silence even when dishonor pressed hardest. Most would have broken. Didn't answer immediately. She stared straight ahead, her hands still steady at her sides. Finally, I took an oath. Kingston nodded once. Not praise, not pity, just recognition. Not everyone remembers theirs when the cost grows personal. The car door shut behind them, muting the chaos outside. Only then did feel her muscles tremble, a faint release of tension. She had carried herself like stone for so long she had almost forgotten what it meant to breathe freely. The drive across the base was brief. At the helicopter pad, rotors spun, throwing grit into the air. The loomed ahead, ready to carry them to Washington. Kingston raised her voice above the roar. The president wants a full briefing. You'll have your chance to tell the story, classified sections included. Nodded, but inside doubt lingered. Could she tell it? Could she relive the moments that had already carved scars across her mind? Could she reopen wounds not yet healed? The helicopter lifted, the base shrinking below them. For a moment watched the ocean stretch vast and endless, sunlight glinting across its surface. She thought of the teams she had trained with, the men who had doubted her, the ones who had fought beside her anyway. Some alive, some not. She thought of the oath she had carried even when it broke her. And for the first time in months, she felt something that frightened her more than the trial ever had. Hoping. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. Hours later, Washington waited. The Pentagon loomed, its corridors humming with secrets. Security ushered them quickly, avoiding the press who had already gathered outside the main entrance. Inside, the silence was heavier, controlled, the weight of classified work pressing against every wall. Kingston led her into an office, Spartan, functional, but undeniably personal. Photographs of ships, a model destroyer on the desk, the kind of mementos only a lifetime sailor would keep. Sit, Kingston ordered gently, pouring coffee into 2 cups. At ease, Commander. We're past formalities here. The cup warmed hands. The smell was sharp, grounding. She hadn't realized until then how starved she was for something as simple as being treated like a human being, not a prisoner, not a defendant. Kingston's eyes softened for just a moment. I apologize for not intervening sooner. We needed to let it play out to see who else was involved. His voice was quiet but steady. Drake and others. The Admiral nodded grimly. Deeper than him. He sold intelligence to private contractors, and rather than face espionage charges, he chose to bury you. The words cut, even if she had already known the truth. Betrayal didn't lessen with repetition. Turned her gaze down into the coffee. He knew no one would believe a woman could lead a SEAL team. He used society's bias as cover. Kingston's smile was razor sharp. The arrogance of mediocre men never ceases to amaze me. And for the first time let herself exhale a laugh, small, bitter, but real. The conversation turned to what came next, awards, clearances, public vindication. But thoughts wandered elsewhere. The families of the men who hadn't made it out of Yemen, the operators who had followed her into, their sacrifice still buried in classified files. She lifted her eyes. Their families deserve to know the truth. Kingston's gaze softened. They will. Partial declassification has been approved. Their names will be honored, their benefits restored. For the first time, composure cracked. Her throat tightened. She blinked hard once, twice. She would not cry, not here, not in front of anyone. But the weight in her chest shifted. It wasn't gone. It never would be. But at least now she wasn't carrying it alone. What does it mean when the system you swore to serve nearly destroys you? That thought lingered as stood before a panel deep inside the Pentagon. The room was windowless, sealed with layered security, the kind of place where words never left unless authorized. Seated across from her were men and women whose titles were hidden behind initials, whose clearances extended into shadows most Americans would never imagine. The Secretary of Defense sat at the center, the Director of National Intelligence to his left. The others remained nameless, their identities masked by silence and classification. For 3 hours spoke. Her voice carried steady, though each word pulled memories from scars that hadn't yet closed. She described the intelligence trail that had led to Yemen, the discovery of the black site, the desperate improvisation when the extraction plan collapsed, the 17 hostages, including 2 children of senators, who had survived only because her team refused to quit. She described, too, the betrayal, how Drake had funneled details to private contractors, how his treachery had endangered the mission, how in the aftermath he had erased records, planted false evidence, and positioned her as scapegoat. Her words painted a portrait both of heroism and of treason, and when she finished, silence held the room like a closed fist. Finally, the Secretary of Defense spoke. His voice was heavy, slow, as if dragged by the weight of his own conscience. "Commander Blackwood, the system failed you." She met his gaze without flinching. The system worked eventually. That's what matters. But inside, her thoughts whispered otherwise. No, the system hadn't worked. People had failed, and silence had nearly cost her everything. The officials filed out, leaving only one man behind. Civilian clothes, silver hair, eyes sharp with the kind of authority that came not from rank but from power above it. His clearance badge bore the highest classification. "You showed remarkable restraint," he said, voice calm. "Most would have broken operational security to save themselves." "With respect, sir," replied, "that was never an option." The man allowed himself the faintest smile. "And that is precisely why the President is interested in your next assignment." He slid a folder across the table. No markings on the outside, no label to betray its weight. "For your eyes only," he said. "Consider it an opportunity to rebuild what Commander Drake tried to destroy." Did not touch it. Not yet. The weight of her silence still pressed on her chest. Could she take on another shadow mission when she hadn't finished grieving the last? The man read her hesitation. "You've already proven you won't bend. That makes you rare and necessary." Then he was gone, leaving the folder unopened on the table. 6 months later. Morning fog rolled in off the Pacific, shrouding the Navy's special warfare training grounds. The cadence of shouts carried across the sand as trainees strained under the weight of log PT, their bodies shaking, their voices raw. walked the perimeter, her boots sinking slightly into damp earth. Her uniform bore the oak leaf of a commander now. The scar from temple to jaw caught the pale sunlight, no longer hidden, no longer softened by makeup. She wore it like she wore her name again, openly, without apology. Her presence drew whispers, though most pretended not to look. For weeks, headlines had carried her story. The court-martial overturned, the Admiral's intervention, the confirmation of her name had been cleared. Her honor restored, but honor restored was not the same as peace. As she watched, a young ensign approached, nervous, determined, the kind of nerves recognized from her own past. The woman snapped to attention. "Ensign, ma'am, preparing for SEAL qualification next month." Gestured for her to walk beside her. 4 weeks, that's not much time. "I know," hesitated, then admitted, "my weakest area is water confidence." Studied her hands. "The skin on your knuckles. You've been practicing knots underwater, that's good, but practice isn't enough. You need calm when your lungs scream." Blinked, surprised she'd been read so easily. "They say you could identify a target at 3 kilometers just by movement." "People exaggerate," said, though the faintest smile betrayed her. More questions followed, about training, about endurance, about belonging in a community still skeptical of women in its ranks. One by one, other female candidates drifted over, drawn like moths to the woman who had survived both battlefield and betrayal. "Is it true you had to do twice as many pull-ups as the men?" one asked. "No one gets through by doing the minimum," replied. "Did you ever think about quitting?" "Every day, so did everyone else. The difference is who admits it." Finally, one candidate asked the question that hung heaviest. "How did you handle it, knowing that even after you proved yourself, they still tried to take everything away?" The group fell silent, studied the young woman's face, seeing not challenge but genuine need. "By remembering why I was there," she said quietly. "Not for recognition, not for being the first or the only, but because there was work that needed doing, and I was capable of doing it. Remember, it's not about being the first, it's about making sure you're not the last." Her words settled over them, heavier than surf pounding the shoreline. In the distance, a helicopter descended, blades chopping the air. Admiral Kingston stepped out, now retired from active duty but serving as special assistant to the president. Civilian clothes, same unmistakable authority. She spotted, raising a hand in greeting but not interrupting the moment with the trainees. "Looks like my meeting here," told the young women. They dispersed reluctantly, carrying her words with them like small anchors against the waves they would face. Kingston fell into stride beside her. "Quite a fan club you've built." "Future operators," corrected. "The dropout rate for female candidates has decreased by 30% since your story broke," Kingston said. "Correlation isn't causation, Admiral." "Always the analyst," Kingston said with a faint smile. They entered the command building, where a secure briefing room awaited. Inside, senior officers and intelligence officials leaned over documents, operational maps spread across the table. They rose when Kingston entered, then quickly returned to business as she waved them down. Stood before the display screen, activating a projection. Operational data filled the wall. "Phase 1 of Operation Kingfisher is complete," she reported. "We've identified primary financial channels supporting the PMC network across 3 continents. Their reach extends deeper than Drake ever revealed." For an hour she briefed them. Connections, flows of money and weapons, recommendations for next steps. Her voice carried steady, but her thoughts drifted between the lines. She had once been nearly buried under silence. Now she wielded information like a weapon. When the briefing ended, the others filed out, leaving and Kingston alone. "The committee approved Phase 2, Kingston said. "They want you to lead it personally." Nodded back into the shadows. "Where you work best." There was silence then. the kind only shared between two women who had both fought wars not just against enemies abroad, but against disbelief at home. Finally, Kingston spoke. "There's something else. The Navy wants to use your story in recruiting materials." Stiffened. "With respect, Admiral, I'm not interested in being a poster child." "I told them you'd say that," Kingston said. "But consider this. Your story has already inspired a generation. Imagine what it could do if properly told." Didn't answer. Not yet. The idea unsettled her. She had never sought recognition. And yet she couldn't ignore the faces of the young women she had spoken with that morning, the ones who needed to know they weren't alone. The Admiral studied her, then let it drop. "No decision today, think about it." Later walked alone along the beach. The sun burned off the last of the fog, the Pacific stretching vast and merciless before her. In the distance, trainees strained under boats, their voices hoarse but determined. She thought of the folder still waiting for her back in Washington, the mission that would take her team into hostile territory again, the future that pressed forward whether she was ready or not. Most of all, she thought of that moment in the courtroom when Kingston's salute had cut through everything. It had not saved her career. It had reminded her that dignity doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply acts. How do you walk back into shadows when the last ones nearly destroyed you? That question followed as she stepped onto the tarmac in Djibouti, the night heat pressing down like a second skin. The air smelled of dust, aviation fuel, and ocean salt carried inland. A joint task force had been assembled, operators from SEAL teams, Marine raiders, Air Force Special Tactics, and even a pair of CIA paramilitary officers. Men and women accustomed to silence. Warriors who understood what it meant to fight where no headlines followed. She was their commander. And for the first time since, she felt the weight of leading again, not just carrying her own survival but theirs. The briefing tent was dim, lit by the glow of projectors and the hum of portable generators. Maps sprawled across the table, layered with red markers tracing shipping routes, bank accounts, safe houses. Operation Kingfisher was bigger than, targeting the private military network that Drake had been feeding. A network that stretched across continents, faceless yet dangerous, shadowed by foreign intelligence services with their own agendas. Stood at the head of the table, her scar catching the light. Her voice was calm, precise. Primary objective: identify and dismantle the financial hub supporting the contractor network. Secondary: secure intel on ties to foreign state actors. Expect layered defenses, mercenaries, not soldiers. Their loyalty is bought, not earned. That makes them unpredictable. The men listened, some nodding, some unreadable. Had seen the doubt before, operators sizing her up, questioning silently whether she belonged at the front of the room. She ignored it. Doubt was wasted energy. The CIA officer, a graying man named, leaned back in his chair. "You're talking about hitting a network that doesn't officially exist. No flags, no uniforms. You burn them down, you'll make powerful enemies." Met his eyes. "Better we burn them than they burn us." Silence settled, heavy and final. The mission began at dawn 2 nights later. Their target, a fortified compound on the outskirts of Somalia. Intelligence tagged it as both a logistics hub and financial node. Inside were servers, hard drives, and human assets who knew too much. The approach was silent. A blacked-out C-130 dropped them miles from the coast. Zodiac boats skimmed across waves, engines muffled, the night swallowing their wake. His hands gripped her rifle, her breathing steady. She hadn't led a team since Yemen, and as the shoreline loomed, memories pressed in: gunfire, sandstorms, blood on her gloves. She forced them back. This was now. They hit the beach, boots sinking into wet sand. Shadows moved in precision, weapons angled, eyes scanning. At the compound, drones hovered high above, their feeds streamed to operators in her ear. Guards patrolled inside, armed but lax. Mercenaries rarely carried discipline. Signaled, two Marines cut the power grid. Darkness swallowed the compound. Suppressed rifles whispered. One guard dropped, then another. Her team moved like tidewater, steady, relentless. Breach charges opened doors, night vision goggles cutting through the dark. Voices rose inside, shouts of confusion, of panic. Led from the front, her scope found a target in a hallway, a man scrambling for a weapon. One shot sent her mass. He fell without sound. For hours they cleared, searched, secured. Servers pulled. Hard drives stuffed into packs. One man taken alive, zip-tied, eyes wild with fear. By dawn, the compound burned. Explosives rigged in the server room erupted, fire curling into sky, smoke a dark signal over the coast. The team exfiltrated across the water, the horizon bleeding with early sun. Sat in the Zodiac, her rifle across her knees, the spray of seawater stinging her face. She should have felt victory. Instead, she felt the familiar ache, the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Back at base, intelligence analysts swarmed the drives. Numbers appeared, links drawn, offshore accounts, shell companies, transfers from places that should have been allies. And buried in the data, a name. Drake. Even in custody, his fingerprints remained. Stared at the files long after the analysts had left. Her hands tightened around the printouts. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. Drake had not acted alone. He had been part of something larger, something still alive. That night she walked alone along the wire fence of the compound. The stars burned overhead, sharp against the black sky. The desert air carried silence. She thought of the young women back at, the ones who had looked at her with hope, the ones who believed she had broken barriers for them. She thought of the men she had lost in Yemen, the ones whose silence she had carried until Kingston's salute. And she thought of herself. She was, yes, but scars meant survival. Apprentice's voice echoed in memory. Silence won't save you. He had been wrong. Silence hadn't saved her, but it had preserved something greater, her oath. Now, though, silence would not be enough. This time she would need to speak, to lead, to fight in ways beyond the trigger. The following week, Operation Kingfisher expanded. Targets identified in West Africa, Eastern Europe, even back channels in Washington itself. The network was everywhere and was at its point of attack. Her team trusted her more now. They'd seen her in the compound, steady under fire, precise under pressure. Doubt had begun to fade. Respect, unspoken but real, had taken root. But in quiet moments, alone in her quarters, still wrestled with the cost. Every mission carried ghosts. Every silence carried weight. Late one night, Kingston's voice came through on secure line. "You did well in Somalia, but it's bigger than we thought." His response was calm, but her chest tightened. "How big?" "Global, and we're already late." The line crackled. The words hung heavy. Late. Sat in silence long after the call ended. She looked at the folder spread across her desk, the maps, the photos. She thought of the next mission, the next breach, the next silence she would be forced to carry. And then she whispered it aloud, not for anyone else but for herself. "I'm ready." The words tasted like steel. Not hope, not fear. Resolve. What do you do when the betrayal you hunted overseas begins to look like a reflection at home? That question shadowed as she stood over a table in a forward operating center in Ghana. Maps stretched across the surface, red pins stabbing into regions where the network's operations bled across borders. West Africa was a feeding ground for private military contractors, oil fields, mineral routes, smuggling corridors. Every thread they pulled led not just to mercenaries, but to bank accounts, corporations, lobbyists. And the deeper they dug, the closer the line seemed to bend back toward Washington. Stared at one line in particular, money funneled from shell companies in Virginia, traced to the same network Drake had served. The paper trail was clear, deliberate, almost arrogant in its sloppiness. One of her operators, Sergeant, leaned over the map. This doesn't happen without someone protecting them on our side. Didn't answer immediately. Her silence had once been armor, but now it cut both ways. If she admitted it, if she spoke the truth out loud, the implication would spread like wildfire. The network wasn't just overseas. It had roots at home. She finally said, "That's what we're here to prove. Until then, it's speculation." But speculation gnawed like a blade under her ribs. That night, the team launched a raid on a convoy moving weapons across the border into. Intelligence said the cargo wasn't just rifles and explosives, but encrypted drives meant for transfer to foreign buyers. The ambush began in darkness. Dust rose under armored wheels. Shadows of vehicles rolled down a desert track lit only by starlight. His voice in the comms was calm, precise. "Wait for the signal, 2-1 mark." Explosives lit the night. The lead vehicle erupted in fire, the convoy stalling in chaos. Operators opened fire, their weapons cutting through confusion. Mercenaries scrambled, returning fire without coordination. Moved with the team, rifle steady, each breath measured. Her scar caught glimmers of firelight as she pressed forward, her commands sharp, controlled. Then something shifted. One of the vehicles broke formation, not fleeing but circling. Its gunner laid suppressive fire with precision far beyond mercenary training. Recognized it instantly, the rhythm, the discipline. This wasn't a hired gun. This was military. "Cover left, move," she barked, pulling her team behind cover as rounds tore into the sand around them. The firefight lasted minutes, though it felt longer. When it ended, smoke curled into the sky, the convoy destroyed, the team collecting weapons, drives, and one badly wounded prisoner. But's mind was on the vehicle that had circled them. The accuracy, the formation, it wasn't random. Someone had trained them, someone who knew the way operators fought. Back at base, interrogation began. The prisoner was young, bloodied but alive. He wore no insignia. His eyes darted wild until stepped into the room. He froze. "You were trained," she said quietly, "not like a mercenary who trained you." His lips trembled. His gaze flicked to the corner camera, then back to her. He whispered one word. "Americans." The room went silent. Apprentice's voice echoed in her memory. "You're not asking the right questions. Ask who benefits." Now she had the answer, and it threatened everything. The drives confirmed it. Embedded in the data were communications between contractors and a consultancy firm based in Washington. Buried in the emails were names: lobbyists, former officers, a congressman on the Armed Services Committee. Felt the floor shift beneath her. She had spent months proving she wasn't a liar, wasn't a fraud. And now, to carry this truth forward meant risking it all again. The system that had nearly destroyed her once could do it again, this time with even sharper teeth. Her team looked to her for direction. Blunt as always, finally asked the question, "Ma'am, if this goes up the chain, what happens when the chain is part of it?" Silence stretched. She thought of Kingston, of the president, of the salute in the courtroom that had lifted her from ruin. She thought of the families of her operators, trusting her to bring their sons and daughters home. Finally she answered, "Then we don't go up the chain, we go around it." It was dangerous, reckless even, but her oath was to mission first, not bureaucracy. That decision was tested days later. The team moved into for another raid, an airstrip where contractors were funneling weapons through disguised cargo. The night was moonless, their movements masked by silence. Everything was according to plan until the first shot rang out, before they had breached, before they had been seen. Ambush. Rounds cracked from high ground. Explosives detonated near their flanks. Mercenaries moved with coordination, discipline, too much for coincidence. They had been compromised. Ordered fallback, her voice sharp through the comms. Smoke north, cover fire, move. They fought their way out, but not without cost. Sergeant took shrapnel to the leg, blood soaking into desert sand. 2 others carried him as they ran. Drones overhead guided them to extraction, but every step was a fight against fire pressing close. At the site, engines roared, rotor wash kicking up dust as helicopters lifted them out. Crouched beside, pressing a hand to his wound, her eyes locked on his face. His breathing was shallow, his voice rough. "Ma'am, how'd they know?" She didn't answer, because the truth clawed at her throat. Someone in Washington had sold them out. Back at base, medics worked on. He would live, but he would carry the scar forever. Another reminder of betrayal's cost. Sat alone in her quarters after. The room was bare, cot, table, maps pinned to the wall. Her hands trembled for the first time since the courtroom. She stared at them, the same hands that had steadied rifles, carried hostages, buried teammates. Her silence had saved her once, but if she stayed silent now, more would bleed. She picked up the secure line. Kingston answered after one ring. "Talk," the Admiral said. His voice was low, steady. "It's bigger than we thought. They knew we were coming. Someone in Washington fed them." Silence crackled across the line. Then Kingston's voice, harder than steel. "Names." Glanced at the files spread across her table. Politicians, former officers, shadows tied to power. "I'll get them," she said. It was a promise and a burden. She hung up, her reflection faint in the window. For the first time since, she saw herself clearly, not prisoner, not defendant, not victim, but commander. And commanders didn't stay silent when betrayal bled into their own ranks. What happens when the enemy you're hunting wears the same uniform you swore to defend? That thought stayed with as she walked the corridors of the Pentagon again. The polished floors, the muted lighting, the quiet hum of classified work, it all looked the same. But now, with the names in her pocket, with the proof burned into her mind, she felt the walls pressing closer. The files from Operation Kingfisher were undeniable. The private military network wasn't just foreign contractors and mercenaries. It was fed, funded, and shielded by Americans. Lobbyists, former officers, and at least one sitting congressman had lined their pockets with blood money. And someone in Washington had leaked intel that nearly got her operators killed in. But proof wasn't protection. Proof was a threat. Entered the secure briefing room. Kingston was already there, standing at the head of the table, her eyes sharper than had ever seen. Around them sat men in suits, senior officials whose identities were deliberately blurred by titles like advisor and liaison. Laid the files down. "This is the network, not just abroad, here, in Washington." The room shifted uneasily. A man in a gray suit adjusted his tie. "Commander, these are serious allegations. Do you understand the damage if you're wrong?" Met his gaze without blinking. "I buried teammates because of this network. I'm not wrong." Kingston watched in silence, her jaw tight. She knew what was doing, burning bridges before they even asked her to. The gray suit leaned forward. "This needs to be contained, quietly. Exposing names could destabilize." "Cut him off." "Destabilize what? Their careers, their influence. Men died, my people nearly died, and you're worried about stability." Her voice rang louder than intended. The room fell into silence. Kingston finally spoke, her tone even. "Commander Blackwood's findings will be. In the meantime, Kingfisher continues." The meeting ended with stiff nods and colder silence. As the others left, Kingston lingered. She looked at, and for the first time her voice carried something like warning. "You're making enemies, Commander." His reply was calm, but her chest felt like stone. "They made themselves enemies when they sold us out." Kingston studied her for a long moment. Then, "Watch your six. In Washington, knives don't always shine before they cut." That night returned to her quarters. A plain envelope waited under her door. No name, no markings. Inside, a single photo. Her team. The men and women of Kingfisher, caught candid in a mess hall, laughing unarmored for a rare moment. And across the photo, scrawled in red ink, "They bleed because of you." Sat heavily on the edge of her bed, the paper trembling in her hands. She'd faced bullets, explosions, the chaos of combat, but this was different. This was the kind of war fought in shadows, where silence killed as surely as shrapnel. Her silence had once protected lives, now it endangered them. She burned the photo in a metal waste bin, the flames crackling, the red ink curling into ash, but the words seared into her. The next mission came quickly. Intelligence pointed to a meeting in Tripoli, contractors negotiating arms shipments with foreign handlers. High risk, high payoff. Briefed her team with clipped efficiency. Target is inside the Shura district, heavily defended. Extraction window, 20 minutes max, no margin for error. They moved at night, their convoy slipping through narrow streets. The city was alive with neon and shadows, music from distant clashing with the silence of alleys where danger breathed. The breach was swift. Gunfire erupted, shouts echoing off concrete walls. Moved with precision, her rifle an extension of her breath. The target was secured, dragged out zip-tied and blindfolded. But as they pulled back, the trap closed. RPGs lit the night. Mercenaries swarmed, far too prepared. Again they'd been compromised. Ordered fallback, her voice sharp, commanding. Smoke, flank left, move now. Her team fought through alleys, bullets sparking against walls, the target dragged between them. Blood slicked the ground, the chaos alive with screams and fire. At the site they barely made it onto the bird. One operator, Corporal Davis, took a round through the vest. He lived, but barely. In the roar of the helicopter, sat with blood on her gloves again, pressing down on Davis's wound, her teeth clenched. She looked at the others, faces pale, eyes burning with the same question. How did they know? The answer clawed at her throat. Back at base, Davis was rushed into surgery. Stood outside the field hospital, the night pressing heavy. She felt broken in a way the courtroom hadn't touched. Then Kingston appeared beside her, her voice low. You were compromised again. Didn't turn, someone's feeding them. Kingston's silence was confirmation enough. Finally said, if I don't stop this, more will die. My team, others, and you'll lose the war before it starts. Kingston's reply was almost a whisper. If you push too hard, they'll silence you again. And this time there may not be an admiral walking through the door. The warning landed heavy, but already knew the truth. She had survived court-martial, she had survived betrayal, she had survived silence. But survival wasn't the mission anymore. The mission was truth. 2 nights later she made her choice. She gathered her team in the briefing tent. Maps spread out, but this time her words were not just about targets abroad. There's rot in Washington, she said, her voice calm but steady. They've compromised us twice. They'll do it again unless we cut them out. The room went silent. Her operators looked at her, some stunned, some nodding. Leg still bandaged, spoke first. You're saying the enemy's not just out there, it's here. Nodded once. Then we follow you, said simply. The others echoed agreement, not loudly, but with the kind of conviction that came from men and women who knew trust in combat was not optional. Looked around at them, her throat tight. They deserved a commander who would protect them, even if it meant standing against her own institution. And so she made a vow, one she spoke aloud for the first time. No more silence, not if it costs you, not if it costs us. Her words settled like stone. She knew what it meant. Another fight not just in deserts and cities abroad, but in corridors of power at home. Another trial, perhaps, another scar. But she also knew this. She would not let her team bleed for secrets someone else sold. And for the first time since Yemen, her silence broke. How much does the truth cost when silence has already taken everything from you? That question was no longer theory for. It was the reality waiting for her in Washington. The mission in Tripoli had ended in fire, blood, and compromise. Corporal Davis survived surgery, but his body would never move the same. Limped through recovery, scars marking him deeper than flesh. Her team followed her still, but their eyes held the same question hers did. Who betrayed us this time? And the answer was no longer across oceans. It was here, home. Returned to Washington under orders, officially for debrief, unofficially because the situation had grown too dangerous. Her arrival was met not with honor, but with cold corridors and faces that looked past her, as if they already knew what she carried. She was escorted into a secure conference room. The table was long, lined with men in uniforms and suits. Kingston sat near the center, her jaw set, her eyes heavy. The gray suit from before leaned forward, voice smooth as silk, but edged with steel. Commander Blackwood, Operation Kingfisher has produced valuable results, but your recent claims about leaks, about names, are inflammatory. They threaten national security. Stood at the far end of the table, hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight, her voice calm. National security isn't threatened by my words. It's threatened by the men selling our secrets. Murmurs rippled. A general leaned forward. Careful, Commander. You're making accusations that could ruin careers. Her eyes cut to him steady. They already ruined lives. Careers are the least of it. Kingston's voice broke the tension, low but commanding. Let her speak. So spoke. She laid the files on the table, the bank accounts, the emails, the links between contractors overseas and power in Washington. She named names, lobbyists, former officers, a congressman. The silence after was heavier than combat smoke. Finally, the gray suit exhaled. Commander Blackwood, do you realize what you've done? Yes, she said, I told the truth. The meeting ended with no verdict. Just silence, colder than before. Left the room knowing she had signed something, whether her freedom, her career, or both. That night threats arrived. Anonymous calls. Cars idling too long near her apartment. She ignored them. She'd faced worse. But her team, her people, were in danger too. That was the cost she could not accept. She met Kingston in a quiet office away from the Pentagon's lights. The Admiral's voice was low, almost weary. They'll come after you now, you know that. Sipped cold coffee, her face unreadable. Let them, I won't stay silent. Kingston studied her, eyes softening. Most people, when cornered, protect themselves. You keep protecting others, even when it breaks you. It's not sacrifice if it's the oath you took, said simply. Kingston leaned back. For the first time, the Admiral's expression carried something like pride. History won't remember the trials. It'll remember the silence you refused to keep. The following weeks unraveled fast. Investigations launched. Headlines screamed of corruption, betrayal, secrets exposed. The congressman resigned under pressure. Contractors scrambled, their networks burning under scrutiny. But's name was dragged again through the fire. Commentators called her reckless. Some painted her as a hero, others called her dangerous. The Navy kept its official distance, unwilling to choose sides in public. Through it all, carried herself with the same stillness she had in court. She didn't answer questions shouted by cameras. She didn't defend herself in interviews. She had already spoken once. That was enough. The price came, as it always did. She wasn't imprisoned. Not this time, but her career stalled, promotions delayed, assignments shifted. Whispers followed her through the halls. She was both legend and liability. And she accepted it. Months later, she walked the beach yet again. The morning fog rolled in, trainees grunting under logs, instructors barking orders. She stood apart, her boots sinking into wet sand, watching the cycle she had once endured repeat itself. Young faces, determined voices, doubt and grit mixing in the salt air. A small group of female candidates approached, hesitant at first. One finally spoke. "Ma'am, did you ever regret it? telling the truth. Looked at them, their eyes wide, their uniforms damp with sweat. She thought of the courtroom, of Kingfisher, of the men she had buried. Her answer came soft, steady. Regret lives short, silence lives forever. They nodded, their shoulders straightening, their resolve hardening, and turned back to the sea. The sun broke the fog, casting light across the waves. The Pacific stretched wide, endless, indifferent. She thought of the salute in the courtroom, the moment Kingston's hand had lifted, the moment her silence had been recognized not as weakness, but as honor. She thought of the oath she had carried when no one believed her, when silence nearly broke her, when truth nearly destroyed her. And she knew this, she would carry it still, into shadows, into silence, into whatever came next. Because some battles were never about victory. They were about dignity. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.